Welcome to America's Heroes Group.
And welcome back to America's Heroes Group, our roundtable within our partner, Chicago Regional Office of Veterans Benefits Administration, the Jesse Brown VA. October is Breast Cancer, Mental Health, and Natural Disability and Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Today is Saturday, October 8th, 2022. Our host is Cliff Kelley. I'm Sean Claiborne, the co-host. Our executive producer is Glenda Smith, and our digital media producer is Ivan Ortega of Scouts Honor Productions. And we have our panelists on the line, Tracy Kukla-Lewis. She's your Chicago Regional Office Training Manager, oversees training compliance. And we're going to talk about the character of discharge from the military, the benefits available without a discharge, and how to apply for a discharge upgrade. A very sensitive topic among people in the military who have not had an honorable discharge. We're going to go into that and get more details about it. How you doing, Tracy?
I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good. So tell us, first of all, tell us about what the different types of separation, if you could rank them. Yeah. So maybe a better way to do it is kind of go through it and kind of look at what the different types of discharges are, and then kind of talk about what they mean. Because a lot of people who listen to this program are civilians. They have no idea what we're talking about when we say discharges. They think if you either got honorable or dishonorable discharge, but there's really like 8 different kinds of discharge. Is that correct?
Correct. So for our purposes at the VA, when a veteran is discharged from service, they get a DD-214, and the DD-214 will specify the character of their discharge. So you typically want to see honorable, but then there's general, under honorable conditions, and uncharacterized. And then you have other than honorable conditions and bad conduct discharges. So for VA purposes, everything for us is good. The under honorable conditions, general, uncharacterized, those are good for our purposes. We don't really look at those. The ones that we focus on are the other than honorable or the bad conduct discharges.
So when you look at those, what are you looking at them for?
So the reason that we're looking for them is what happens is if a claimant files a claim, we look at the type of character of discharge that they have, and then we go from there. So we find out like why they were discharged. So there's regulatory bars and then there's statutory bars for VA benefits. The regulatory bars, typically the discharges or the reasons that we see are willful and persistent misconduct and like moral turpitude. Those are the 2 big ones that we see as a basis for the discharge. The regulatory bars, the person would not be eligible for VA compensation benefits, so the monthly payments, but they would be eligible for VA medical treatment.
Okay.
For those that have a statutory bar discharge, they aren't entitled to anything for VA purposes. So they're not going to get the monthly compensation benefit, and they're not going to get the health care benefit either.
So to be clear,
that's why it's
go ahead.
So, go ahead.
Good. Well, to be clear, so if you have on your DD-214, if you see a bad conduct or a dishonorable, that you can't get any medical benefits at the Jesse or any VA, basically.
It depends. We have to look into the circumstances behind. We have to determine if it was a regulatory bar or a statutory bar that's involved. So we actually look at the actual conduct involved, and then we make a decision. And we type up a decision and we send that to the claimant.
Okay. And then what are
depending upon the results of that?
Okay. So what are the negative consequences of a punitive discharge, like bad conduct or dishonorable or anything really less than honorable? How does it affect you in the civilian world as far as job opportunities, things like that?
So the civilian world I am not familiar with. I've worked at the VA for 21 years, and so I'm focused all on compensation benefits. That's been my focus for the last 21 years, and I'm not a veteran myself.
Okay. So what in the Jesse Brown VA system or the VA system in general, what benefits are available then to honorable people versus anything less than honorable that a person might miss out on? I know education benefits come into play. And I know also we just talked about some medical benefits, but what other things are there? Like, for example, maybe the VA guarantee loan, for example.
Yeah, like the GI Bill and home loans and stuff, again, like that's all centralized. So I'm not familiar with the requirements. I'm assuming that if they don't have the honorable, that they there may be issues with them being entitled to those. But I just know that for VA purposes, for healthcare, compensation purposes, that if you have an other than honorable discharge or a bad conduct, then they won't be entitled to compensation benefits for sure, and they may or may not be entitled to VA treatment.
So then what are their options? So a person gets less than honorable, or maybe they get a bad conduct, what can they do to try to get that changed so they can get benefits?
Sure. So what they need to do is they should first file a claim with the VA, and they can do that with an easy form if they've never filed a claim before, or if they have filed a claim before, they're going to need to file that 200995, that supplemental claim, and start there. And then they're going to list whatever conditions they're claiming, a left knee, a back, hypertension, whatever. Then we go from there. So then we get their DD-214. We do that for all cases, and we look at what's the character of their discharge. If we see that it's other than honorable or bad conduct, we get their entire personnel file and we ask for all the facts and circumstances regarding that discharge before we make a decision. We will send a letter to the claimant saying, hey, your DD-214 shows this other than honorable or bad conduct discharge. And we give them an opportunity to explain if there's any extenuating circumstances, or basically any opportunity to explain the basis for their discharge. And we give them 60 days to respond.
Now, from what I understand, go ahead.
So then once that 60 days expires, whether or not they respond, then we make a decision, a formal decision. And we can, our avenues are, we can find them honorable for VA purposes only. So we can't overturn what the military has their discharge as, their character of discharge, but we can kind of do it for VA purposes only. So if we find them honorable for VA purposes after reading all that evidence, and we say, okay, we're going to find it honorable as like minor conduct, say, then that if we find it honorable for VA purposes, then they will be entitled to VA compensation benefits, that monthly payment, and then they're also entitled to VA health care. If we determine that they are dishonorable for VA purposes, then we have to make a decision as to whether or not they're eligible for health care. So if they're dishonorable for VA purposes, they cannot get that monthly compensation benefit, but they may or may not be able to get the VA treatment. And so all of that will be in a decision.
Okay. So what makes first of all, talk about this. What's the difference? Get more in detail, because it's kind of a little blurry in the sense of what the difference is between upgrading or getting change in the character of your discharge versus getting an upgraded discharge. I know upgrading your discharge is very difficult from what I understand, but changing the character is something that is a lot easier and usually what you recommend first.
Right. So they can do two avenues simultaneously. They can pursue the VA route through us, through the Veterans Benefits Administration, and file their claim and let us do a decision just for VA purposes only. It doesn't affect the outside world, just the VA world. But then they can also simultaneously basically dispute, if they feel like their discharge was unfair for some reason, they can go and file with their military service agency, their branch, and dispute their discharge that way and ask for like an upgraded discharge. So there's two different forms that we send claimants when we're doing this, because we encourage them to do this at the same time that we're processing their claim. They can file a DD form 293 and a DD form 149. And those forms are very detailed, and they give you the specific address depending on the branch of service involved as how to ask for an upgraded or a changed discharge. Because again, we can't change that characterization that the military gave them. We can only kind of do it for VA purposes. And I know this has been like a big upcoming topic lately. And so if a claimant had like PTSD or a TBI, or let's say they had some sexual assault or harassment going on, or if they felt that their discharge was unfair because of their sexual orientation, then we highly recommend that they pursue that avenue with the Department of Defense as well.
Are you
because they have more options than we do. And if the Department of Defense changes their character of discharge, that's the better avenue for them, because then that affects, the GI Bill, that, helps them with, getting federal jobs or state jobs, veterans preference, all that. So that would be, we tell them kind of pursue both avenues simultaneously.
Okay. And then are you seeing more veterans talk about maybe going into the VA to get help as far as changing the character or upgrading their discharge because of the legislation and things around the country regarding marijuana use? Because marijuana was strictly forbidden in the military, but now it's becoming legalized across the country. So how has that changed the dynamic?
So, yeah, I've definitely seen in my 21 years at the VA a dramatic increase in people filing supplemental claims, that 0995 form, where in the past, maybe a long time ago, we made a decision that we found their service dishonorable for VA purposes. And just a lot more filing claims that have the bad discharge. Maybe in the past they just didn't bother to file. But I know that this is a big hot topic right now. I know the Federal Registrar in 2021, I believe.
America's Heroes Group is proudly sponsored by attorneys.
So we had a little break in the commercial. Sorry about that. So you continue. You were saying that you've seen an uptick over the last few years, definitely with people trying to get their discharge changed and also trying to get their character changed.
Correct, and I believe there's more of a encouragement all over to consider TBI and PTSD, things that were kind of not diagnosed way back when, like when Vietnam was happening. There really wasn't, the PTSD diagnosis didn't really exist. TBI is kind of a new medical thing that we're seeing now, that they're recognizing, I should say, more, and diagnosing more. Same thing with the sexual orientation issue. So we're definitely seeing a lot more. The Federal Registrar, I had seen in 2021, they're proposing to actually basically revamp the VA regulations when it comes to character of discharge, and it seems like they're heading towards being more liberal. So I foresee in the future that if they do in fact implement what was proposed, that we're going to see a lot of claims dealing with character of discharge.
One of the things, I know we can't talk on this topic, but one of the things I found is doing research on this, because I know people who've been in the military who have dishonorable discharges and have less than honorable discharges and so on. It is tough for a lot of guys. I remember when I had a good friend of mine who passed away. He was in the Army right after Vietnam. And he was saying that when he joined the military, his family had all been in the military, similar to mine. And he said to me, his father told him, is that if you go into the military, which they actually discouraged him from doing, which they had military history in their family. His father was in the military. He said, whatever you do, come home with an honorable discharge. If you do nothing else, I don't care if you become a captain or if you become this or private or your whole career, but come home with an honorable discharge. And for job opportunities and things like that, and what I understand is that is actually public record. It's particularly if you have a punitive discharge or anything that has anything like for a bad conduct or something that had a punitive element attached to it, because it might end up in the court, and that's all public record. So when people do background checks for housing, for jobs, they can sometimes pull that, although it's not always common where they get that information, but that actually can have a negative impact on your job career, your housing situations, all kinds of things in the civilian world.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right, and like you were...
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, like you had mentioned before, how has it changed with, now marijuana is legal in the state of Illinois. We're kind of seeing that change too, slowly, that of becoming more liberal and kind of looking back at what were the policies way back when. So I always encourage people, if they feel that their discharge was unfair or they really had extenuating circumstances that were never taken into consideration during our initial decision, like maybe our initial decision said it's dishonorable for VA purposes, come back in with a 200995 form and tell us why. Explain something, because we can go ahead and look at that other decision and maybe we can change it. Maybe we can find it honorable for VA purposes, or if we deny Chapter 17, maybe we could grant it. So I always encourage, there's no harm, it doesn't cost anything to file a 20995, a supplemental claim, and dispute something that was previously denied or a decision that you don't agree with.
Now, how hard is this process? What's the timeline typically from what you've seen from your years of experience? And is it necessary or helpful to get help from a veteran service organization or maybe even an attorney? Is that even something that could be done?
Yeah, I have a high regard for the service organizations because they're highly knowledgeable about our VA benefits and what is needed to substantiate a claim. But, I just say that the process, I think the important thing is a lot of times when we send that letter saying, hey, explain the reasons behind your discharge, we give them the opportunity. A lot of times they don't respond at all. And, we weren't there. Those of us processing the claim, we weren't there. If something was going on, like if there was racial tensions or, if someone was discriminated against because of their sexual orientation, we have no way of knowing that because likely that's not documented in their records, right? So we need them to write us a statement or request a hearing and tell us that information so that we can consider it. Because if they don't tell us that, we don't know about it and we can't consider it. We've also kind of moved towards reviewing BVA decisions because some of the regulations they're kind of vague. So like what is willful and persistent misconduct, right? That's kind of vague. And what is moral turpitude? Those are two regulatory bars, but the regulations aren't very, they don't describe them in detail. So that results in like inconsistent decisions. And I know that the VA is now they are recognizing this. And they're moving towards, okay, let's look at our regulations and let's see if we can make them more specific for our claims processors that have to abide by those. And that way we can make more consistent decisions nationwide.
And what's the timeline typically? So if someone's going to initiate this process, what should they expect realistically before they get a resolution?
So it's going to be a minimum of 60 days because any time that we see that there's a bad discharge that exists, we have to send this due process letter that basically says, hey, you have 60 days to request a hearing or tell us about your bad discharge. So that's a minimum of 60 days right there. We cannot make a decision unless they waive that 60 days. But after that, it's not too long of a decision for the actual character of discharge determination itself. Once we make that decision, then the rest of the claim may take longer. So if we find them honorable for VA purposes, or we say, hey, it's dishonorable, but you can get VA treatment, then that extends the length of the claim because once that decision is made, then we send it to the next stage in the process and saying, do we need to schedule a VA exam now? What conditions are they actually claiming? And then continue it as like a regular claim.
And then once you do this, let's say they get denied, is there an appeal process?
Yep, there's an appeal process. They can take any of the 3 review options that we have available. They can do the 0995, that supplemental claim. They can do the 20-0996, and that'll go to our Decision Review Center, DROC, or they can go directly to BVA.
And so what are some tips that would make a successful application? So they submit their paperwork, and it seems like they would also maybe need some documentation or some type of written narrative as to what happened, why they should be considered for an upgrade or for a change of character. What are some of the things that you can give them as tips as to what they need to have a successful claim?
So for these specific claims, I would say please respond to our letter, and it may be difficult, but we need you to tell us if there's extenuating circumstances behind the way you were discharged. If you feel in any way it was unfair, like I said, if you had PTSD or you suffered a TBI and that caused you to do things you normally wouldn't, or you suffered a sexual assault in service and that resulted in going downhill and making bad decisions, we need to know that because we are allowed to take that into consideration. And I know it's difficult things to talk about. So that's why like you had mentioned, maybe a private attorney or a service organization may be beneficial because they may be able to help them word that, or type that up or support them while they're doing that. Our public contact team also can help veterans do that. But I know there's things that are hard to talk about, but we need them to talk about them or request a hearing. If they request a hearing, that's basically the same thing as typing up a statement, but you can have a hearing with one of our decision makers and explain, hey, these are the extenuating circumstances that happen. Please consider it.
And on that note, and people are afraid oftentimes that if they go and try to create or try to get something changed, there's going to be an adversarial process. I got a speeding ticket here in Chicago. There's with these speeding cameras, which everybody's trying to protest against because they're crazy. And so, the process of, I had all this evidence lined out. I had actually it was a speed camera ticket. Okay, I actually went to the intersection. This camera gives out the most tickets in the state of Illinois.
Yikes.
Yeah, and it's actually been, they've had news reports on it. There is actually, here at WVO1, there's actually a campaign against it here at WVO1. Mark Wallace, who has done a show here, he's been trying to lead a campaign about it. But I went to my hearing, and I brought actual photographs, their own photographs, by the way, that the city of Chicago took of me, supposedly, which you can't see me driving the vehicle, but that doesn't matter to Chicago. And I measured out all the angles and distances of how fast I traveled in the time that they said that I traveled. And it was obvious I wasn't speeding. You look at the math. I was looking at math, but it was an adversarial process. They did not care. It was like I was fighting against someone instead of looking at the evidence and saying, hey, let's talk about this and get to a resolution. So if a veteran goes to the process, is it going to be adversarial where it's you against them? Or are they kind of trying to figure out, what is the best solution? What is just and fair for our veterans?
Right, and I hope no one ever sees our process as adversarial. I am sure it's hard not to see. It is a complex process. It can be complex, but that's why we have service organizations and private attorneys that help through the process, or a public contact team if they come into the regional office. It shouldn't be adversarial at all. We just need, like I said, the veterans to speak and tell us their story, so that we can take it into consideration. Like, we try to give them the benefit of the doubt. It's not our money that we're giving away, so we try to say yes when we can, following our regulations as much as possible. So I don't want anyone to see it as like, oh, they just want to say no, because we're not a for-profit organization. It's not coming out of our company's. Yeah. So we want to help veterans. I mean, I want to thank the veterans that are listening right now, or service members that are listening to your show. Thank you for your service. I admire veterans so much, and that's why I've dedicated my career towards working for them.
So let me ask you this question. When you have National Guard veterans, Army Reserve veterans, regular Army veterans, and Marines, and so on, is there a difference as far as benefits access? I'm not sure if you're the person to ask this question, but since you're dealing with benefits and things of those natures, is there a difference between the different types of benefits that reservists and National Guard get versus regular military service members?
Not for VA compensation purposes. The only difference would be that if someone's currently in the Reserve or National Guard, yes, they can file a claim for compensation benefits. But if they do their drill weekends, we stop their pay. Like, we can't pay them VA benefits at the same time that they're getting if they get called on to active duty, or they have their inactive duty for training or something. We kind of keep track of those throughout the year, until they're finally retired or whatever. But then they know, and we tell them that we have to stop their benefits so they're not double paid during that time. But that's the only difference. I mean, they can still file claims that, retired veterans get.
And one other thing I've read, and this is in actually some of the old military books I had or whatever from a long time ago. So officers, is it true that officers have a different process than enlisted soldiers or enlisted members?
For the VA, nope. We just treat them all as veterans. We treat them all the same.
Okay, but for maybe perhaps another end, because they said something like that officers can't be, I had it written down, but officers can't be downgraded in rank, but they can be dismissed, but then they can keep a lot of their benefits that they normally would not get if they were enlisted.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm not familiar with, just because I'm not a veteran, so
okay.
I'm not really sure. And for our purposes, we don't look at that. We don't look at what their rank was. I don't even pay attention to that at all when I process a claim.
So what would you say is the most important thing for veterans to know if they're trying to, if they're thinking about maybe upgrading or getting VA benefits, but they have something less than honorable? What's the most important thing that they need to know right now?
So file a claim. If we said no a long time ago, especially, file a supplemental claim. You know, society changes, times change, attitudes change, laws change, circumstances change. If you were denied, especially in the Vietnam era, we were much stricter back then. I would say file that 20995 form and just give us a statement. We don't expect you to go out and get all this evidence and things. Just give us a statement saying, hey, I don't think my discharge was fair because of this, or I would like, these extenuating circumstances considered, and that's all they need to write. They don't need, a biography. We just need a couple sentences or a paragraph about why they think that we should change that initial decision, and then we should make a new decision. Hopefully it won't stay the same, but it could stay the same or it could change, but we just need something from them.
And I think we have to go back to that previous point you made, which is there are stories out there that are untold, but people have been bottling these stories up for so long, and it's not just the weight of the story or the trauma that maybe they experienced, whether it be because of discrimination or maybe a sexual assault, a military sexual trauma, or even a traumatic brain injury, whatever it might be that might have caused you to do something that was against the guidelines or regulations. But you got to get the courage to step up and actually make your voice heard and actually say to the powers that be, hey, this is what happened to me. And then collectively as veterans, if we can get more of those stories told, maybe we can help change and maybe evolve the military into a stronger fighting force, a stronger, more organized and fair system.
Exactly. It's just that's the biggest obstacle I see right now is getting these veterans to tell us their story, and because some of them it's very sensitive topics, it's difficult, but we need them to tell their story because we weren't there, and we can't consider it because I'm guaranteed a lot of this stuff is not going to be in their records that we have access to. They're not going to say, oh, we treated this person unfairly, So we need them to open up to us or their service organization or the private attorney that's helping them and tell us the story.
And on that note, so we got to wrap it up. So make sure, veterans, you go out and think about your career. If you have anything other than an honorable discharge, think about filing those appeals and those claims. Make sure that you get the recognition you deserve for your service. Thank you for your time. Tracy Kukla-Lewis, he's the Chicago Regional Office Training Manager and oversees training and compliance. So we just talked about discharges and upgrades of your discharge recommendation on DD-214. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
This is America's Heroes Group.